This is not fair. The death of a child is just not fair. Whether it's your child, any child, it is just out of order for what we feel is natural. We all know that we are going to experience grief at some point in our life. We're going to lose our grandparents and going to lose our parents. We do not prepare for losing a child. We do not prepare for losing siblings and spouses in young ages. So how do we actually deal with that when death is out of order? Do you just want to scream when someone says, "Oh, time will heal your wounds," or "Your child died 10 years ago. Why is it still impacting you?" This idea that grief heals with time is absurd when it comes to the death of a child. I also want to scream when someone says it was God's plan, or God knew you were strong enough to handle it. Don't worry, your child's in heaven. And I have been through significant spiritual conflict and wrestling with God. Maybe you don't even believe in a God, but when people who don't understand are just trying to make sense of your pain, the death of a child, and have it make sense in their reality, because they don't want to understand your pain. And honestly, I don't want people to understand our pain. I don't want this to happen to anyone. Another thing that makes me scream is the 5 stages of grief. Oh, are you in depression? Did you go through denial? Eventually you'll get to acceptance. Doesn't that make you want to scream? Unfortunately, I am an expert in grief. I happen to be a psychiatric nurse practitioner, highly trained with a doctorate, but I've lost children. And if you're watching this video, you've probably lost a child, or someone you care about has lost a child. So how do you actually deal with that? The pain is unbearable, but you have to feel the pain, but it's unbearable. I have 3 initial things kind of help you along this journey of dealing with the death of a child. There are things that you can do. The first thing is to acknowledge that this is a traumatic process. Losing a child is traumatic. And I can tell you, even with all of my professional experience, both academically and clinically, I denied having trauma. I kept just talking about grief and controlled grief. So I'm going to help you fast forward a little bit. And the first thing I want you to do is acknowledge that out of order, death of a child is a traumatic process, regardless of how the child died. So acknowledging that it's a traumatic process, I would say now we have to separate that trauma and that grief, right? Grief and all of the grief theories, when they talk about ending and acceptance and integration, and there's different words in the different grief theories. But the goal of grief is to process this pain and to cherish the relationship. That is not the goal in trauma. When we acknowledge that losing a child is traumatic process, then we can separate the trauma. And when you work in trauma, you process that trauma to release it. And there's multiple techniques to do that. I talk a lot about brain spotting because that's what I've used, but other energy techniques from acupuncture to different energy healing, but also EMDR is a thing that a lot of professionals use, but it is an actual process of not just thinking about the trauma, but releasing it, separating the emotions from the memory. And so, but we don't do that with grief. You don't want to separate the emotions from the memory. You want to remember your child deeply and forever. And so grief never goes away. But if we can learn to separate, if we can acknowledge, first we acknowledge that losing a child is a traumatic process. And then you separate that so that you can work through that trauma separately than you work through that grief. The second thing that I want you to do is untangle all the enmeshment that is attached to your grief. In the Mentally Strong method, we have these 10 categories and we separate things because things are dealt with differently. But even not knowing the Mentally Strong method, you can learn to separate, right? So we talked about that first step of separating the grief and the trauma. What about the negative thoughts that are going on in your mind? That is different techniques, right? When you have negative dialogue, your responsibility is to change that negative dialogue. So I can share some of mine and see what you identify with. But have you ever thought, I'm not a good mother? It's my fault that my child died. If I would have done this, my child might still be living. That is negative thoughts, and that is not serving you, regardless of the reality of the process. And I can tell you, in the death of all of my children, actually, I can find blame for myself. In Johnny's drowning accident, I had told this teenage boy that he should wear a life jacket when he's in the river, but I didn't tell the adults that were taking him to the river. I didn't mandate it. I didn't make sure that it was going to happen. And so it would be very easy for me to have that dialogue that it was my fault. The day that Reggie died, he wasn't breathing well most of the day. I didn't take him to the emergency room because he had had days like that. I miss the signs of death, and I'm a nurse. Can you imagine how I was beating myself up? My daughter died in her sleep. Maybe I should have been sleeping next to her. It doesn't matter what the story is. My two friends that I told you lost their child. One of them was a medical error, and she's a nurse. And she thought, maybe I should have been more adamant. I knew they shouldn't have transported him without oxygen. I should have done this, or I should have done that. Is the dialogue that she could be susceptible to. My other friend who lost a child in a drunk driving accident, teenage boy, not the driver. He should have never gotten in the car with that kid. And they beat themselves up often if they would have just not let him go out that night or made a different decision that day, that something would have been different. Regardless of your story, the negative dialogue is not serving you. And just like the grief and trauma, it needs to be separated and dealt with differently. And I could go on and on. The injustice of what has happened to you is different than the grief. My friend who lost her son in the drunk driving accident, she speaks for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And that is how she's working through and processing some of the injustice. They went to court to prosecute the person responsible. Doing those things don't actually help your grief. They help the injustice. And so this is why it's important that we separate these things. And if you've seen my documentary, you know that I had pretty significant spiritual conflict after my third child died. So the three things are: one, acknowledging that the death of a child is a traumatic process. Two, we're going to separate all of the factors that are influencing your mood and getting enmeshed with your grief. And lastly, I want you to dig deep and believe that you have purpose. Not that your pain has some mystical purpose. You're just going to beat yourself up about that. That's not what I'm talking about. A reason, a belief that you are still alive and responsible for working through this pain because you have a purpose. Now, it might not be similar to my purpose of sharing publicly and vulnerably about grief. That is not for everybody. Maybe it is to speak for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Maybe it's to privately help other parents. Maybe it's to privately help kids. Maybe it's to continue raising your children. When you are faced with this out of order, dealing with traumatic grief, right? Remember, traumatic grief, this is a traumatic process. We have to treat it as such. Yes, we are going to grieve and we're going to hold these things dear. And part of my grieving process is to sit around with pictures of my family. I have a photo book for each of my children. And sometimes I just sit here and I look through these photos and I look at little letters that she wrote me. And yes, I cry because it hurts, but I wouldn't give up this pain to not have had her or any of my children. But again, we have to understand that this is traumatic grief and that the trauma needs to be separated from the grief. And all the other stuff that it messes with needs to be separated. So we can take the time and remember, this is Maya's book, and we can remember Maya, and I can love her, and she can still love me, because that's grieving. The other stuff is getting in the way of the grief. I have a few questions from people that watch my videos and stuff. The first question is, I watch your videos and I want to do the things that you're saying, but I just can't. That sounds like clinical depression. And I want you to acknowledge and think of it that way, because you may need professional intervention. But when I think of the mentally strong method, that is definitely a negative dialogue. The whole I can't. I struggle with it too. I often say that. One more thing happens and I'm just like, I can't do anymore. So that's a negative dialogue. And so I want you to put that in your negative thoughts. What can I replace I can't with? I think I can. Maybe that won't work for you, but maybe saying I can do one thing a day that might take me 5 or 10 minutes, right? So make it attainable. Stop saying I can't and put an I can with an attainable thing, right? Right now, it looks like this huge mountain that you could not climb. But could you take one step? Just make something I can and make it attainable. And that also goes into behaviors and choices. What we say we can't do, we can't do. And so remember, go back to the 3 things I talked about in this video. Acknowledging it's a traumatic process. Separating those things. And then believing that you have a purpose. And to fulfill your purpose, you're going to need to work through this pain. And that does not mean letting go of your grief or accepting the fact that your child has died. Those things are absurd to me. And that's why we have to separate the trauma from the grief, because the grief you hold tight, you make things for them, you hold them tight. I hope that helps, and I hope you can dig deep enough to find the I can. Oh, next question. This is a really difficult one. The reader says that she's lost a child and she's trying to work through some of the things that, I talk about, but her child was a twin, and the twin sister is who she is most worried about and wants to know how to help the twin sister, the one that lost her twin. And I will go back to, what they always say on the airlines where, put on your oxygen mask before you put on your child's. You cannot teach someone how to grieve if you don't know how to grieve. So whatever you're doing, make it open and vulnerable to your child, to her twin. So if you're putting together a photo album, have her involved in that process. Don't cry silently. It's okay to cry with the other people that love your child. But I did this wrong with Johnny. When Johnny died in the drowning accident, I had 6 other children to raise. I just became hyper-focused on being a mom, and I didn't actually grieve. And it's not healthy. And it won't allow your child to grieve if you're not grieving. They're looking to you. So figure out how to grieve. Help them to see the difference between the trauma and the grief. And depending on the age of the child, is how you have to talk about it. But the fear, the anger, all of those things are separate from the grief. And so you have to kind of bring it down to their level. But they can understand that grief is to cherish, and they want to talk about their twin. And I would say a twin dying is definitely a traumatic experience for the other twin. And so acknowledge it as that. It is also a traumatic process. Last question. My child died 10 years ago in the midst of me raising my other children. I feel like I did a good job. I went to counseling. We talked a lot about the grief. We worked together as a family. But now I'm an empty nester, and the grief is flooding me like depression. I talk about this in my documentary. The same thing with me. I am now an empty nester. I'm also a widow. I am a different person. And So you're going through like a cumulative grieving process. Empty nester is a grieving process, but oftentimes it's a happy grieving process. Like you're happy that your children are independent and on their own and doing well. But then you're also alone. The other thing about being a busy mom is it's real easy to make everything about the children and not take care of yourself. So I'm very proud of you for taking time to do counseling. And it may be an opportunity to do that again. But I want you, like we talked about in this video, acknowledge losing a child as being a traumatic process. And is there anything additional that you didn't do back then that you need to do now about releasing trauma? And maybe spend some more time in controlled grief. We think because it was 10 years ago, we shouldn't have to feel the pain anymore. And that's not true. We will have to feel this pain for the rest of our lives. It's just the intensity and frequency in which we have to feel it should decrease. So keep watching. I have a whole playlist around grief, and I'd love for you to be a part of our community. So join our grief community.